So go ahead and say your name first, and then go ahead and say your question.
My whole name?
Yeah, sure.
Every single word in my name?
No, you can do as much of your, or as little of your name as you want. You can do just your first name or your whole name, whatever you want.
My name is Faith Marie Brady West.
And then what's your question?
Why would the Israelites complain after all God had did for them?
That's a good question.
That is a great question. Do you want to kick us off, Ann?
Sure, I'd be happy to. That wasn't supposed to happen.
Oh, I can if you want. You're right.
You're supposed to start off, and then
I can if you want.
You know, that really is a great question, and I'm sure she's talking about when the Israelites left Egypt and made their way out into the desert. And just coming back from Israel just a month ago, that desert is just a brutal, brutal place. It is hot. It is dry. There is not a lot of vegetation, and there's not a lot of water. So you can imagine them leaving Egypt, where, by the way, they were not content there either. They were struggling in a difficult way. They were oppressed. They were having to make bricks with straw, and then the straw was taken away. So they were horribly oppressed. And then the freedom came, and they began making their way out into the desert. And one of the greatest things would be water. You cannot survive in that place without water. So they would complain, rightfully so, and call out for water, which God provided for them. And then they seemed to forget what was happening back in Egypt. They thought, boy, we had it better out back there. You know, we want to go back to Egypt. But faithful God made sure they had manna and quail every single day for that journey. It's really interesting. Whenever we're in dire circumstances or when we're unhappy, we tend to complain. Now, I'm sure you all don't, but we tend to complain when things don't go our way. Can you imagine eating pizza every single day for 40 years? Wouldn't we start to complain about that? But God put that story in the Bible, number one, to show of his great faithfulness throughout all the generations, and to show us that human nature has been prevalent all the way from the very beginning. That when we don't have our needs met, we begin to complain. But God loved them. God took care of them. He was able to get them all the way to where they needed to go.
That was so thorough, Ann. That was wonderful. I don't know that I have anything brilliant to add. When I heard the question, I immediately identified with the student, because as I have read through the story in the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, I have often thought that same thing. God just rescued you in exactly the ways that you had prayed. You had prayed that God rescued you from slavery, and God rescued you. And then only a few weeks into the desert, they're upset and complaining. But I think it's really easy sometimes when we're reading scripture to, as we're moving quickly through it, to see how God has worked consistently in the lives of the other more easily than it is to see how God has worked consistently in our own lives. And I think, why did the Israelites complain? Well, why do we complain? I think that my own memory is so short-term. I think that we as people often forget the ways that God has been gracious throughout our stories. And I think that's one of the reasons why God commands them to remember throughout those books. As they're journeying, you can see God challenge them to remember what they have been set free from, because in remembering, we are more oriented to where we are presently. So that is a wonderful question, and
just one other thing. I read the other day somewhere in a devotional that it said, whenever we want to complain and we're getting ready to let those words to come out of our mouth, to stop and think of something that we can thank God for. And I think maybe that might help break the chain of constantly complaining, that we just stop and thank the Lord for something wonderful he has done.
I was reading something else this week, or a couple weeks ago, that was talking about, it was neuroscience. It was what happens to the human brain. And it was something like 1 to 5 is the ratio. So when your brain experiences something negative or something difficult, you have that experience one time and it is imprinted into your brain really strongly. In order for your brain to have the impact of having a happy memory, you have to repeat that experience to yourself at least 5 times before it will stick. And scientists believe that is partially over the development of human history, right? When you need to remember where the poison berries are because you'll die if you eat them, and having a happy memory isn't as important for our survival as humans. But as we've continued to grow and develop as humans, there might be some really negative impacts from the ways that we continually saturate ourselves with only negative news and negative information that has a real impact on our brains. And that it takes discipline and intentional thought to remind ourselves of positive things. So I think that also really fits into how humans, we are made in such a way that it is much easier for us to remember the negative than the positive.